All right, welcome to this episode of Photo Theology. I'm your host, Doug, and today we're going to be looking at the Pentax KR versus the Nikon D7000 and an ISO matchup. Now, what I have done here is I did adjust the white balance of the Pentax KR. The reason for it is that I was using a free RAW program called Able RAW, and as with all RAW programs, when you deal with DNG files and RAW files, the program manipulates it based on how it was programmed to perceive the image. So I had to do a minor adjustment there. However, what I did was this: is I put the white balance on auto white balance. I did the same for the Nikon though, okay too. So I was completely fair about it. That was adjustment number one I made. Adjustment number two I made was I lowered the Nikon's resolution from 16 megapixels to 12 megapixels. The reason being was very, very simple. It comes down to the fact that it makes it a whole lot easier for you guys to see on the screen. The third thing is I lowered the lighting for both cameras by 10%, and that dealt with brightness, if you're wondering. Okay, so that was how the test was actually set up here. The images you will see here are going to be images that were shot with a 70 millimeter Sigma lens prime 2.8, and the other thing you are going to see here is that these images were taken from digital imaging resource. They were taken from digital imaging resource. So the reason for that is because there was consistency in the shooting. I'm not one of these people who believes that, hey, let's go test out the Canon, with the, L lens that costs $1,200 versus comparing the Olympus or the Fuji or the Sigma or whatever camera else that's a non, top tier brand of market seller with a, kit lens that comes with it. I don't do that stuff. Okay, I know a lot of people do, and that's their business. But if you want to keep it real, then you got to keep everything fair. So that's how I approach it. Now the first test you're going to see is going to be a 3200 light rating test. As far as this goes, the Nikon and the Pentax did pretty well. The Nikon is on the right, the Pentax is on the left. In this matchup, you do have a greenish white balance cast with the, I want to say, Pentax. The Nikon has a semi bluish one, and the Pentax is semi green. Okay, but if you look close enough, you'll notice it. But both actually look really good. They both do. I mean, it's one of those things, honestly, where you look at it and you say, yeah, you know what? If you weren't comparing them side by side, would it make a difference? And with that part said, the thing you also want to keep in mind is that the Pentax KR runs about, I want to say, 600, 650. The Nikon runs normally around 14 to 1500, depending on, where you're buying it. The Pentax will come with an 18 to 55 lens. The Nikon will come with an 18 to 105 lens. Now, dealing with these models here, both models are actually pretty fair in comparison. The autofocusing on the Nikon is a 35 cross focus, which is pretty good. The Pentax will be using I want to say it's a 15 point. It might be a 9, but I think it's actually a 15 point autofocus system. The Pentax is actually quicker on its autofocusing, full autofocusing, than what the Nikon is. The Nikon is better when it comes to manual, and when it comes to continuous, and when it comes to pre-focusing. So it's pretty interesting when you talk about the autofocusing speeds. Camera-wise, though, I mean, if you're going for the fast focusing, just straight from the camera, it does go to the Pentax over the Nikon in this case. Now, with that being said, realistically, if I'm going to compare the Nikon D9 or the Nikon D7000, I'm sorry, not the D90, but the D7000 up to the Pentax KR, then I would simply purchase the Pentax or the Pentax 17 to 70 millimeter lens. That would stick me at, I want to say, roughly 1200, 13ish hundred price point, and that there would be fair game for the Nikon. The only thing I wouldn't have is the video ability of the Nikon. But my autofocusing speed would be excellent. The image quality would be excellent. I'd have a better wide. Of course, the Nikon would have a better telephoto, but you can't have everything in every camera. But keep in mind, as the models set, if you were to buy them straight out of box with their kit lens respective, Pentax is about 600, 650. The Nikon is going to be about 14, 1500. That's how it's going to work. But as you can see at a 3200 light rating, there is not a whole lot of difference here between the cameras at all, really. But I do think the Nikon has a bit of a sharper image. I do. And I think that plays to the favor of the Nikon there. Just comes down to the price point. Now we get to the 6400 light rating test here, and you really do have to ask yourself the question, for the kind of money that you're looking at for the Nikon for the 1500, is it really worth it over the Pentax KR? The reason why I'm willing to use the Pentax KR partly is just the speed, the specifications, and stuff like that. The way the camera is actually designed. The camera actually has in-processing capabilities, and the camera has the ability to adjust your hues, your white balance, your saturation. You can do all that actually in real time as you're taking your pictures. I've done shoots with my Pentax K20D, and you can literally take your shots semi-perfectly to perfect if you know how to actually use the camera. And the camera is very straightforward in the way that it works, or at least my K20D is. The KR, when I used it, was actually pretty good too. I had no problems with it whatsoever. And it's very different from the Nikon system, because the Nikon system does not allow you to see your images in real time to make your hues adjustments, your white balance, so on and so forth. Some higher Nikon models may be able to do it, but I want to say your baseline Nikon models actually don't do that at all. And also you have post-processing capabilities with the Pentax and the Nikon, but the Pentax's post-processing capabilities literally blow the Nikon away. Like, for example, the Pentax has a black and white, but you can use a blue filter, a gray filter. You have color extract from your images that you can post-process. This is all on the camera itself. There's a number of things that you can do with the Pentax from a shooting standpoint. You simply just can't do with the Nikon. And I think that's pretty amazing there. You can even convert your black and white to various different versions of black and white with the Pentax and what have you not. And of course, you have the ability to readjust your hues, your saturations, and all the above if you've taken your pictures in RAW and if you want to post-process them. Meaning that you can literally do your Photoshop, depending on what you're going after, right there inside the camera. Not to mention, too, you do have built-in HDR capability. My Pentax does up to about 9 exposures. I can shoot in real time, and the camera will overlay each image, which is pretty cool. Nikon, I think, does like 2, but there you go. But to the point of the RAW testing here, as you can see, the Nikon and the Pentax are pretty close on even ground. The one thing I did notice about the Nikon and the Pentax when I looked at it here is the Nikon uses the Sony Exmar-R backlit sensor, and it's the 16 megapixel one. It's the same thing that's in the Sony Nexus. The Pentax K5 actually uses a sensor too. And when you look at the noise, it almost looks like the noise is put into the back of the image. Like the noise exists, but it's almost like it's shoved to the very back of the image. And you'll notice this when you get to higher ISOs. Where the Pentax KR's noise looks like it's actually at the front of the image. Now, your actual grains of noise, I'm just going to call it the grains of noise, your actual grains of noise are bigger with the Pentax, and they're smaller with the Nikon. That's just how it plays out with this. However, there are certain advantages and disadvantages to both cameras in the way that they deal with their noise. The one thing I have to say about the Pentax is the Pentax is very even across each ISO as far as color contrast goes, so on and so forth. The Nikon tends to bleed its colors in certain categories. You'll notice this a little bit with the reds, and you definitely notice this with the blues with the Nikon. Now, in all honesty, the Nikon does have an issue with color accuracy. They always have. It's nothing new. and you can just look at the color palette and you can tell. The Nikon does exaggerate just certain colors. But if you look at it at various ISOs, you'll see that the color exaggeration is not always consistent within those ISOs. And that's one thing I do find um, very very interesting. Keep in mind, though, this is not something that I would, hold against the Nikon unless we're talking about, some pretty high stakes. But at that point, I'd also have to look at what the competitor to the Nikon is, too. But, no camera's built perfectly. I mean, that's just the bottom line to it. There is no camera that's built perfectly. So, where I may like the Pentax for a variety of reasons, the truth is the Nikon in this situation does arguably have the better noise control. You can definitely see this as you get to your higher ISOs. It's almost like it's a build-up for the Nikon. But the question is, begged to be offered here, which is for $1,500, is this is it fair? Or should the low light shooting performance of the Nikon be that much better than the Pentax for the $1,500? Now, it is kind of unfair for me to actually use the Pentax KR because the Pentax KR is one of the best low light shooting cameras out there, and in its class, there's really nothing that can touch it. In all honesty, I mean, there really isn't any other camera out there at its price point that can touch the Pentax KR, unless you're talking about the Sony Nex 5. But then again, if you're talking about that, that's like a completely different breed of camera altogether. Which at some point I'm quite sure we'll do a comparison there as well. But here we get to the 26,000 ISO, and the 26,000 ISO is by far, the worst of the worst. How should I say? The 26,000 ISO is almost unusable. But I will say this: I think both cameras handle it pretty well. Depending on your point of view, depending on what you're going after, it honestly will set your tone or set the tone for you in terms of what camera you're going to prefer. With me, this is where it really pointed out that the Pentex's you know uh, noise is pretty much almost at the forefront of the picture when you compare it to the Nikon, where it looks like their noise is at the back of the picture. And this is one of the advantages I would honestly say you have with backlit technology here. The Pentax sensor is not a backlit sensor by any means. It may have great exposure, I want to say exposure metering and stuff like that, but it's not a true backlit sensor in the sense of what the Nikon is, or I want to say Fuji's new like CCD backlit sensor that they just came out with is, and so on and so forth. And actually, so our Nikon sensor is Sony sensor, so I guess that really doesn't change much of anything. But as you can see here, it's a very interesting ride. I mean, it's a very interesting ride between the two. I personally think that the Pentax KR is overall the superior shooter in terms of SLR in comparison to the Nikon D7000 if we're talking about price and performance. If we're talking about, what the Pentax KR is going to be able to offer you for its money versus what the Nikon is going to offer you for its money, I'm definitely going to give it to the Pentax model. I will do that. But and that's not because I own a Pentax. I'm basing it off of the fact that the Pentax just has more features than what the Nikon does, more usable processing features, and I'm also looking at the fact of the price that you've got going on here too. Like I said, I can easily throw on for the price of the Nikon not only the KR but a 17 to 70 millimeter lens, which would definitely make it worth it. Or I could go with the 16 to 45 or 16 to 45 millimeter lens as well. F4, both are F4 lenses with the Pentax. So you guys get back to me with your thoughts and let me know what you think. All right, until later. Bye bye.